Good morning. Today's lecture is about the United States and the Persian Gulf Wars. That's plural. In the 1980s, Iran and Iraq waged a long and bloody war for control of the Middle East. It was a war that the Western media largely ignored. And the war ended in a stalemate. But as a result of the long war with Iran, Iraq faced serious economic difficulties. In the summer of 1990, Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, the dictator, sought Kuwait's oil wealth in order to expand his power in the Middle East and solve his financial problems resulting from the war with Iran. And of course, Kuwait is on the southern border of Iraq. Saddam told the Kuwaitis to forgive the loans they had made to Saddam during the war with Iran, or face the consequences. The Kuwaitis refused to cave in to this blackmail. On August 2nd, 1990 then, Saddam invaded Kuwait. Within 12 hours, the Iraqis had overrun the tiny little country. The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait was a textbook case of aggression. It was absolutely clear that international law had been broken, and it was similar to the North Korean invasion of South Korea in the summer of 1950, and again, an obvious case of aggression. The United States was moved to respond, as was the United Nations. The United States had three important interests in the Persian Gulf. So why do we care what Iraq did with Kuwait? First, Saddam's invasion of Kuwait provided an opportunity to affirm international law which Saddam had clearly broken. This was the first opportunity since the end of the Cold War for the United Nations to actually function as it was originally intended. Secondly, the United States was also interested in oil. Saddam had started the crisis over oil. And oil was then, and for a long time before, and to this day, the blood, if you will, upon which international industrial economies run. So the oil issue, as dirty as it might seem to some, is an unavoidable fact of life. And so the United States is interested in the reliable flow of oil and a reliable price for that oil, and was absolutely correct to be so interested. The United States was not prepared to see a gangster like Saddam Hussein control 20% of the world's known oil reserves at that time. That would be his own oil in Iraq and that of Kuwait. While at the same time, he would possess the means to blackmail the Saudis, who controlled another 20%. The Saudis, of course, just south of Iraq and Kuwait. In short, if Saddam were allowed to remain in Kuwait and the world does nothing, his foot would be astride the jugular vein of most industrial and industrializing economies. As the crisis dragged on, it was discovered that Saddam would likely have nuclear weapons within 3 years. Indeed, this nuclear weapons issue turned out to be the issue that most concerned Americans: a ruthless dictator with a nuclear warhead. So the United States, just to review for a moment, was interested in the Gulf conflict because of its desire, number one, to uphold international law in the post-Cold War world. Number two, because of oil and its significance to almost all economies in the world. And number three, and most importantly, concern over weapons of mass destruction. In this case, nuclear weapons. So WMDs include nuclear weapons. This last issue will ultimately lead to the Second Persian Gulf War, It did not take long for the United Nations to place an embargo on Iraq to force Saddam out of Kuwait. The embargo made buying Iraqi oil illegal. Ostensibly, no one was allowed to buy Iraqi oil. That would bankrupt the nation in a matter of time. And it also made it illegal to sell goods to Iraq. So that's the essence of this economic embargo, to economically force Saddam out of Kuwait. However, embargoes seldom accomplish their goals, and this one was no exception. It failed to oust Saddam from Kuwait. Meanwhile, he was destroying the country, and his soldiers occupying Kuwait were killing and raping its citizens. Which brings us then to the First Persian Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm. On January 16, 1991, after securing approval from Congress, President George H.W. Bush, the first President Bush, ordered the war to begin. Within 6 weeks, Iraq had been expelled from Kuwait. But Allied forces did not invade Iraq. This is a distinctive of the First Persian Gulf War. The war had not been over more than a few hours when President Bush suffered criticism for not finishing off Saddam. So we ousted Iraq out of Kuwait, but we did not invade Iraq in order to get rid of Saddam in the First Persian Gulf War. Bush's reasons for not invading Iraq and getting rid of Saddam centered around his concern that the effort to capture Saddam Hussein would cost thousands and thousands of American lives, the lives of our soldiers, and it would insert the coalition of nations that Bush had created to oust Iraq from Kuwait, into an internal, and I quote, an internal Iraqi affair. And finally, and this might have been the most important part of it, our Arab allies, and yes, we have Arab allies in this war against Saddam Hussein to expel him from Kuwait. Our Arab allies did not support getting rid of Saddam, and their reason was a very, very realistic one, a great concern. They were afraid that getting rid of Saddam would open up Iraq to a possible Shiite revolution in which a pro-Iranian Shiite government would take over in Iraq. And this Shiite government would be hostile to Sunni Arabs in the area, including Saudi Arabia. So hopefully most of you are aware that Islam is divided into two primary factions, the Sunnis and the Shiites. And oftentimes, most times in fact, these two factions don't like each other very much. So our Arab allies did not support the goal of getting rid of the Sunni Saddam because they were afraid of a Shiite revolution in Iraq. And the Shiites are the majority group in Iraq. Inspections and embargo. Because of Saddam's behavior in Kuwait, the United Nations decided to place an oil embargo on Iraq until he was removed from power. So now this is post-war. There's an oil embargo on Iraq until the Iraqi people rise up and get rid of Saddam. So that's, again, economic coercion to get rid of Saddam Hussein after the war. Meanwhile, Iraq was to be occasionally inspected for weapons of mass destruction, specifically nuclear weapons. But as time went by, and this is one of the problems with embargoes and these kinds of arrangements, Saddam reestablished his power in Iraq, and then, of course, he became less cooperative with the inspectors. And again, as time goes by, the United Nations became less interested in the inspections. People tire of a long-term obligation. Throughout the 90s, President Bill Clinton in the United States did not challenge Saddam. And then when George W. Bush, the son of the previous President Bush, became president in 2001, it seemed he was determined to confront Saddam over weapons of mass destruction. After all, Saddam was in violation of the arrangements and the declarations, the resolutions of the United Nations. September 11th, 2001, and the War on Terror. Well, enter Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden masterminded the September 11th, 2001 Al-Qaeda terrorist attacks on the United States. Of this, there is no doubt. And of course, the United States was intent upon capturing the people responsible for these catastrophic terrorist attacks on that tragic day. Within 1 month, in response to these attacks, the United States invaded Afghanistan, haven of terrorists, and they soon toppled the Taliban government there. Again, a government that was very friendly to the terrorists. We killed and captured many terrorists, but not Osama bin Laden. At least, not yet. Now the Bush administration argued that Saddam had helped terrorists and would continue to do so. Okay, again, an important point. The Bush administration argued that Saddam Hussein had helped these terrorists and would continue to do so unless the United States took him out. But there was no connection between Saddam and Osama bin Laden. Remember, this is history. And in history, one has to have evidence. History, in that sense, is like a court of law. It may be that one suspects this or believes that, but if there's no evidence to support it, then an historian should not say it. Well, since the United Nations weapons inspectors could not truly verify the state of WMDs in Iraq, Bush argued that Saddam was too dangerous to be allowed to remain as leader of Iraq. After all, the inspectors for weapons of mass destruction in the 1990s had not been allowed to go where they wanted to go and see what they wanted to see. Most Americans now were concerned that Saddam might one day develop a nuclear weapon and not use it himself, that would be stupid, but give it to terrorists and kind of, oh, I don't know where they got it. And so that's what the vast majority of the American people are worried about, that Saddam Hussein would give a nuclear weapon to Al-Qaeda or some other terrorist organization. Now, for over a year, Bush negotiated with Saddam and attempted to get most of the rest of the world to ally themselves with the United States as they had done during the first Persian Gulf War. But most of the rest of the world refused to do so. Most of the rest of the world was unconvinced by the available intelligence that Saddam had a nuclear weapon or that he intended to aid terrorists. France especially was unconvinced by this available intel. But Great Britain, our steadfast ally, and most of America became convinced that Saddam had to go. The Second War with Iraq. So on March 19th, 2003, the United States and its allies invaded Iraq, this time with the purpose of removing Saddam Hussein from power and creating a democracy in Iraq. Not a perfect democracy, of course, but some kind of government with democratic aspects moving to a more complete democracy. And in removing Saddam, then, the United States and its allies would be able to ascertain the whereabouts of the WMDs and make sure that those weapons of mass destruction did not fall into the hands of terrorists. So again, this was March of 2003. The formal combat phase of the war lasted only a few weeks. On May 1st, 2003, President Bush declared major combat operations over. Iraq was conquered, and this was essentially true. Meanwhile, the search for Saddam's weapons of mass destruction went on. They were never found, in spite of a concerted effort, kind of a haphazard effort, but nevertheless a major effort to find these WMDs. Weapons of mass destruction were not found in Iraq. This obviated the cause of the war. That was why we went to war with Saddam Hussein. That was why we invaded Iraq. Making a democracy out of Iraq was more a result of our invasion than the cause of it. No, we were looking for WMDs, and Bush was convinced that they were there. How could the United States have gone to war without valid reason? They weren't there, the weapons of mass destruction. Excellent question. Two explanations. First off, one must look at Saddam Hussein himself. Saddam wanted the world, and especially the other Islamic powers of the Middle East, to believe that he had such weapons. Why? For prestige. To be able to play the part of the great Muslim leader who had stood up to the United States. He did not believe until it was too late that the United States was serious about removing him from power. So let's not forget that aspect of this story. Saddam Hussein wants the world to believe that he is the great Muslim leader, that he possesses nuclear weapons. Two, now we have to look at President Bush. President Bush had created a team of aides who gave him intelligence reports that supported what he wanted to believe. His aides knew what he thought, they knew what he wanted to hear, and they gave it to him. And this is why, as a leader of any kind of institution, certainly the President of the United States, you have to have people on your team who are willing to tell you something that you really don't want to hear. And then you have to be leader enough to accept that advice, take it for what it is, compare it to everything else you know, and then act on it, one way or the other. Bush did not like to hear contrary opinions, at least not to the extent that he needed to hear them. In other words, rather than reporting the truth, everything Bush read that was provided him from his aides was filtered through the prism of Saddam already having WMDs. They discounted intelligence that suggested he didn't. So alternative scenarios were not adequately considered. Once the war had been won and weapons of mass destruction not found, now something else had to be emphasized as the purpose of the war, and that was the creation now of a democracy in Iraq. But again, this was not the reason we went to war. This was supposed to be one of the results of our war. And so now the administration did in fact emphasize our new mission in the Middle East, in Iraq, which was to create a democracy there in Iraq, a stronghold of freedom in the Middle East, a nation that the other Islamic Arab nations could look to as an example of what the United States hoped they would all become. Now, of course, even if weapons of mass destruction had been found, Iraq, as I've already pointed out, would have had to have had some new form of government. And we always intended that it be democracy, but we did not spend a whole lot of time thinking about exactly how we were going to create a democracy in Iraq. Indeed, in creating our plans for a new Iraq, we made three fundamental errors. So the errors are now just compounding themselves. One, we had assumed that the vast majority of Iraqis would welcome us as liberators. This was not so. We had visions of World War II in which the American army is marching through France, defeating the Germans and liberating the French. It's a false analogy. When in World War II we marched into Germany, the German people did not receive us as liberators. Well, we're marching into Iraq, and the Iraqi people, some of them welcomed us, but many did not. So we were not seen as the great liberators by most of the Iraqi people. Two, we had assumed that the creation of democracy would not be overly difficult. Again, we look back at World War II, the creation of democracy in Japan and Germany, and we did that. What we forgot was that those two nations were absolutely destroyed. Their people distraught. Their people starving. They would have accepted virtually anything. This was not the case in Iraq. We did everything we could not to destroy the infrastructure and not to unnecessarily target civilians. And 3, we had assumed that there would be really no reason for an occupation plan since we would not be there very long. Again, in World War II, we had spent years, special teams had spent years planning the occupation of both Germany and Japan. These 3 assumptions were underscored when Bush and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, a very important figure here, rejected the Chief of Staff's plan, the Army Chief of Staff's plan, General Erich Shinseki, and in my opinion, Shinseki is one of the heroes of this war. His plan for the combat phase and then the occupation asked for 400,000 soldiers. Rumsfeld advised President Bush to reject that plan as being unnecessary. Bush and Rumsfeld sent about 160,000 troops, less than half what Shinseki recommended. Now, it's true that the Allied armies didn't have a whole lot of trouble taking Iraq. But as anybody who knows anything about occupations would tell you, an occupation can be a very different thing from formal combat operations. And so that 160,000 troops, while it was certainly adequate to take out the Iraqi government, was not adequate to control every village, town, city, street corner, etc. that was needed at this time. Apparently, the Bush administration was oblivious to the fact that Iraq was deeply divided along ethnic and religious lines. Again, the Sunni-Shiite split that I've already described. Not to mention the Kurds, a completely different ethnic group in the northern part of the country. And so the Bush administration made no plans for an occupation that would keep law and order until a new Iraqi government could be created. This was going to take time. Now, within a few weeks, violence between the Sunnis and the Shiites began. The incipient phases of a civil war, a religious war. And then, seeing what was taking place in Iraq, Al-Qaeda terrorists from all over the Middle East came to Iraq. And they, of course, made the situation worse. They have their own agenda. By the summer of 2003, a civil war had begun in Iraq. For the next 3 years, the Bush administration was divided over the correct policy to follow. What do? We had not anticipated a civil war. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld believed in minimizing the American presence in Iraq, and he hoped that the new Iraqi government would soon be able to take control of the country and the Americans could leave. This is Rumsfeld's plan, or lack thereof. Now, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice went along with this for a while, but eventually she began to argue that the United States needed to send enough troops to Iraq to hold ground, rebuild the country, and give the new government the opportunity to survive. Condoleezza Rice. Now, President Bush had always maintained that creating a democracy in Iraq was our goal, but unaccountably, he allowed Rumsfeld to run the war and follow a policy that failed to ensure the accomplishment of Bush's own goal. And so the administration leaders are not all on the same page here. So this civil war goes on for years. Not until after the election, the American election of 2006. This is not a presidential election. That was in 2004. But in the election of 2006, after 3 years of civil war, right after the election, Bush now fired Donald Rumsfeld. The election, by the way, went against the Republicans in rather dramatic fashion. And at this point now, Bush talks about coming up with a new strategy, the so-called surge strategy. And all that means is a surge, an increase in the number of troops in Iraq in order to create a situation in which the Iraqi government can succeed. So this is the so-called surge. This is the brainchild of a Republican senator from Arizona by the name of John McCain, the surge strategy. Well, the surge strategy does in fact bring Iraq to a point of, at least it appeared at the time, in early 2009, after again another 3 years of effort, that the surge strategy had in fact worked and Iraq was on the road to becoming a stable country. But let's take a look then at President George W. Bush's war. There's arrogance here. There's incompetence here. And the result of this arrogance and incompetence has been the unnecessary deaths of tens of thousands, nobody knows for sure, of Iraqis and several thousand American soldiers. Summary. Most American wars are the result of one man's decisions and policies, the President of the United States. The nation has never gone to war without the leadership of the President. And many times the President has convinced Congress to follow his lead. Sometimes the decisions of these presidents and their policies are prudent and necessary. Absolutely true. But sometimes, if we're honest, they are folly. In my view, President George W. Bush's policies and decisions fall into the latter category. They're folly. He created an intelligence culture that gave him only the information he wanted to hear. He rejected professional advice as to how many troops it would take to both subdue Iraq, but then also occupy Iraq. Finally, from early 2004, before the presidential election of 2004, when it was clear that war in Iraq was not over and that the job of democratizing the country was not going to be easy, he refused to change policies. Since leaving Iraq at that time was morally irresponsible, there was only one alternative to do in 2004. Send more troops. Send enough to do the job. Give our military all it needed to accomplish the mission. I'm sad to say that President Bush did not do this in 2004. In 2004, again, an election year, it was clear he believed that if he did the right thing, it might cost him re-election. It would be an unpopular move to escalate the war in Iraq. Since then, rather than admit he had made a mistake, he stayed the course. And then only after 3.5 years of civil war did he make the decision to send more troops. This after the election of 2006 that I've already described, the so-called surge. Again, that surge worked for a while. It worked enough so that President Obama, in the early days of his presidency, felt that it was possible, it was acceptable to wind down the official war in Iraq. And so the last U.S. combat troops were withdrawn from Iraq in February 2009, again in the early days of the Obama administration. But 10 years later, Iraq has gone through periods of chaos and turmoil, and the nation is still very much in doubt. Well, I thank you for your kind attention, and as always, God bless you all.